Good morning.
Hi, thank you, Issa, for welcoming me. Special thanks to Dioceldo Sy for making this possible. I've been to the Philippines many times over my life, very fond memories. It's a very great pleasure to be able to interact with all of you on the question of U.S.-China-Philippine relations against the background of the recent presidential elections here in the United States. Let me begin with the observation that President-elect Biden won almost 75 million votes, more votes than any presidential candidate has in the past. But President Trump won 70 million votes, the second highest total. The conclusion here in the United States is that we have a divided country. I sit here in Washington, D.C., where 92% of the voters voted in favor of Biden, 92%, only 8% in favor of President Trump. But if you go out to the Midwest, places like Montana, Wyoming, you go to the rural areas in states like Philadelphia, even New York State, you'll find that 70, 80%, they voted for President Trump. So we have a big divide, rural-urban divide, urban areas strongly favoring President-elect Biden, rural areas very much committed voting in favor of President Trump. We have a regional divide. The coastal areas, the West Coast, East Coast, pro-Democrats, the Midwest, Southern states, very strongly in favor of the Republicans. We have a divide by education. College educated tend to favor the Democrats, less college educated favor the Republicans. We have ethnic divides. People of color favor the Democrats. Whites tend to vote for Republicans. If you look at the Asian community, and the Asian community is diverse, they're talking about Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos, Vietnamese, Indians. Broadly speaking, the Asian community has voted in favor of the Democrats, but there are exceptions. The Vietnamese, for example, they voted in favor of the Republicans. Even within the Filipino community, which overall favored the Democrats, there are strong groups that are in favor, in fact, of the Republicans and favor President Trump. So you have strong differences across groups, across regions, across localities. What about overseas? If you look at what I call the ethnic Chinese groups overseas, let's start with mainland China. 4 years ago, mainland China favored Trump. They didn't really like the Democrats. They thought they could deal with Trump. Today, it's more divided. There's some in Beijing who would still prefer a Republican winning over a Democrat because they think the Democrats' policies regarding ideology, human rights, democracy might be more strongly pressed by a Biden presidency compared to a Trump presidency. Then if you look at overseas Chinese abroad, generally speaking, they favor, I would say, generally favor Democrats, but not always. Vietnam very strongly has been favoring Trump. Taiwan favored Trump, mainly because of the policies that Trump had in terms of promoting potential Taiwan becoming more independent. So there are views even among what I call the broader overseas Chinese community in Asia in terms of what is going on. Now we face what I call a divided world. So what is President-elect Biden's likely policies? Well, I would first basically say that he's going to move from what I would call Trump's America First strategy to a America Together strategy. He wants to unite the people domestically at home. He also wants to build alliances with the outside world. So if you're going to go from a so-called America Alone strategy to one in which the world is being brought together much more strongly together. How is this going to play out in terms of policies? I'm going to talk a little bit about domestic policies, and then I'll focus on foreign affairs, because domestic policies here influence America's foreign policies. Now, what Trump was basically going with a focus on competing, strongly becoming more isolationist, in many ways dividing the country. So Biden is pushing a much more unified view of what should be done at home. He's going to begin with the pandemic. So you may have already heard today that he's formed his own pandemic advisory board. So that's the first priority. But he's also got to get the economy revived. So he's going to be pushing things like an infrastructure program. He's going to push for more American competitiveness. He's going to try to bring the people together. He's going to work on issues like climate change. He's going to talk about racial divide and see how he can actually deal with trying to reduce the frictions among the various groups. That's a high priority. And I think his domestic agenda will likely dominate his efforts in the immediate future. He will turn to the foreign policy arena a little bit later, because right now the pressing issues are at home. What about his foreign policy issues? Well, as I said earlier, instead of a make America great again or America alone kind of a philosophy, Biden will strive for what I call a more internationalist kind of view of the world, to bring people together, to form alliances, to work with international institutions. I think he will immediately rejoin WHO. He's going to basically work in favor of global climate change policies. He'll go a little bit slower in terms of dealing with trade and foreign investment issues. These are more sensitive, and I'll get to those points basically a little bit later. But there's also going to be what I call a global concern about how fundamentally America's foreign policies will change under Biden compared with President Trump. There's a little bit more suspicion about whether or not American interests are going to be compatible with what I call the interests in Europe, or even with the interests of the Asian countries. So that's something that we're going to have to work on. Let me talk a little bit now about Biden's policies toward China. And later I'm going to talk about US policies, China's policies, and Filipino foreign policies, the three of them together to conclude my initial presentation. If I begin with China policies, Democrats share the same views as Republicans in terms of being very negatively disposed toward China. Pew surveys show that about 70% of Americans have a strongly negative view of China. That compares with about 30-40% 10 years ago. And this means that Democrats are unlikely to come into or formulate policies which are going to be seen as pro-China. They'll continue this, what I call negative China policies. But there'll be a difference. If I could characterize President Trump's China strategy, I would call it chaotic decoupling. I would call what's likely to come under Biden more of what I would call containment with hedging. He'll be much more interested in negotiating. He'll be much more interested in finding alliances. He'll try to build what I call traditional bridges. He'll reach out with the foreigners. He'll be less combative. But he'll also have to be what I would call remain relatively tough on China, because general sentiments are pretty negative. If you look at the constituents in the US shaping China policies, I would say there are three groups. There's the White House, which has been pushing trade concerns, protectionist trade policies, worried about a decline in manufacturing jobs in the US. That's one group. There are American business community, and their concern about China is what I call unfair access. Foreign investment policies in China are discriminatory. They want better access to the Chinese market. They want protection of intellectual property. They're concerned about foreign technology being stolen. That's a second group. Whereas the White House has been arguing about separation or trying to bring jobs more back to the US because of the trade concerns, the second group, the business community, is actually favoring more integration. They want to actually invest more in China. And there is a kind of a conflict here, because if more American businesses actually invest in China, and they actually produce in China, and they'll be exporting back to America, the trade deficit problems that America's been having with China will actually get worse. But the third group has become much more important. They are what I would call the security hardliners. They're essentially worried about a rising China, challenging America's position as a dominant global power. And they will challenge this, so they fear the challenge will come from China's growing capacity in high-tech industries, becoming a more innovative nation. So they see a tremendous need to decouple, to restrict investment in China and to separate the two countries. And now you have a problem because the hardline security group, their policies are directly opposite of what I call the US business community. The US business community wants to foster more integration. The security people want to foster more decoupling. So that's basically the problem that we face. What about from Beijing's perspective? What Beijing sees now is a view that the United States is a much diminished great power, more chaotic, more divided, weaker, and they actually feel that they can actually compete more with the US than they did 10 years ago. But they predict and they realize that the Democrats, when they come into power, will continue to be strongly negative. So they're prepared for what I would call continued tensions. Now, let me turn briefly to the issue of US Filipino Chinese relations. And later on, I want to leave a lot of this discussion to my friends here in the Philippines. As an outsider, I'm acutely aware of the fact that you are in a much better position to judge what is going on in the Philippines and how the Filipinos feel about the US and they feel about China. But let me make some broad observations. Sitting here in Washington, the sense what I have is that your president has been fostering a policy of what I call independence, a little bit more of what I call backing away from the US, a little bit more of pro-China sentiments, but also because of the personalities of your president and the personality of President Trump, a little bit of what I call populist affinity between the Filipino leadership and the Republican leadership today. So you have a mixture of these three forces at play, and they've been basically operating different ways, different points in time. What's going to happen in the future? Well, I think the US is going to basically continue to its policy of trying to establish or maintain a strong presence in the region. And I think two key issues will continue to be concerns for everyone, and that is the South China Sea, which the Filipinos have a strong interest, and the so-called China's Belt and Road Initiative, building much infrastructure and greater links with countries in Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, all the way to Europe. And these are areas which are of concern to the US establishment. And these will be sources of what I call continued attentions in the future. What about what will happen in terms of China's relationships with Philippines, given what's happening in the United States? Well, the United States, I think, will reach out more to ASEAN. It will reach out to the major capitals in East Asia and Southeast Asia. That means that Vietnam, the Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, they will all get what I call more attention from a Biden administration. ASEAN will probably play a little bit more of a stronger political role. In my view, that will also cause China to think a little bit more about how it can deal in a more cooperative way with ASEAN, how it can deal with what I call the tensions in the region. If I had to summarize what I see as the key challenge facing the Philippines, facing East Asia, facing China, and facing the United States, it's basically this. The tensions, which are very strong and very negative today, for it to change, there are two fundamental issues that have to be dealt with. When President Xi came into power in 2013, his theme, his proposal to then President Obama was the following. He was talking about a new type of great power relations. Now that China was second largest economy, and in purchasing power parity terms, actually the largest global economy, China felt that there should be a new type of what I call role for China in the region and globally. And he thought that the United States should recognize that. Formally speaking, the US government has not done that. And this has driven a lot of what I call the tensions coming out of Beijing. But there's another issue. For policy, for the relationships to improve, it will also require change on the part of Beijing's side. And I go back to what Robert Zoellick, who was Deputy Secretary of State, said many years ago. He talked about China being a more responsible global stakeholder, behaving in a way that reflected the fact that it was now a major power. So what you're going to see, I think, in the coming years is a question of how will the US see China as a great power and deal with it? And from China's side, to what extent is it willing to deal with the kinds of negative concerns in the region and coming out of Washington about its assertiveness and its policies, which are causing issues in terms of human rights and in terms of territorial integrity. And these all will affect, I think, Filipino interests in the coming years. Let me stop here right now.
That's actually an amazing opening statement already. And I think the rest of our panelists would like to get in the discussion. So thank you for that. Once again, we do have Mr. Yukon Huang. It's a start to what is a very fruitful discussion. So yes, Mr. Yukon, please do stay with us. As we've already learned so much just from that opening statement, it's now my pleasure to introduce the rest of our panelists who will be joining us to also share their take and knowledge about the relevant subject of the US elections. We have 3 more guest panelists, and they are one of the most prominent names in the local cosmetics industry. Along with his children, he manages homegrown brands like Bilena, Caroline Blackwater. Let's welcome back the founder, president, and chief executive officer of Bilena Cosmetics, Mr. Dioceldo Sy. Welcome back, Dioceldo. No stranger to the world of international trade negotiations, our next panelist is a successful industrialist, business and civic society leader, and resource speaker as well. He has assisted the government since the Ramos administration, including an international trade negotiator for the Philippines vis-a-vis the ASEAN, Japan, and the USA. Please welcome the chairman emeritus of the dynamic Anvil Business Club and director of Manila-based think tank IDSI Integrated Development Studies Institute. We have Mr. George Sy. Good morning, George.
Good morning.
Good morning to you as
well. Good morning, everyone.
And last but not least, among the 50 ASEAN movers and shakers, People Asia's 2019's Women of Style and Substance with extensive experience in communications, economic, as well as social development. Joining us is none other than chairperson of Build Committee, Ms. Ana May Lamentillo. Good morning, Ms. Ana May.
Good morning.
There you go. Thank you very much for being here, panelists. Once again, to our viewers, I actually already see a couple of questions in the Q&A box. Should you have more questions, send them in the comment section below or via the Q&A box here in Zoom. So to our panelists, let's get the ball rolling for the discussion. First, the immediate concern, meaning what will happen in the next month. So Yukon, the possibility of Trump refusing to step down from office. The Trump administration has been threatening to file lawsuits to contest the election outcome. Is this something to be concerned about? We've been talking about what Biden would be doing, President-elect Biden would be doing, but what if President Trump refuses to step down?
No, I think this is a major concern, especially for someone like myself living here in Washington. President Biden has not conceded the election at all. He's launched a legal campaign pointing out what he believes are mistakes that have been made, potentially illegal practices. And these range from not being able to observe the county in some states, to excess ballots being deposited, to misbehavior in terms of polling officials. And let me just state that all the major media observers, all the judges and judicial people who've looked at this, nobody's been able to find any serious evidence of abuse. But nevertheless, he's launching this. You hear only 4 out of the 53 Republican senators who've come out and recognized that Biden has won. The others have remained very, very quiet. You have a president who still commands 70 million votes, about 50% of the votes. He wants a role, and he's not going to leave willingly. And I think he's unpredictable. So today he fired, for example, his Secretary of Defense. It's a standard tradition in the US that when you have a transition from one president to another, the key official that doesn't leave actually right away is the Secretary of Defense, because you want security and the ability to basically make sure that everything is going all right in terms of the military and global conflict to remain steady. So all the other cabinet ministers, secretaries leave, but the Secretary of Defense typically stays on. In this particular case, President Trump dismissed him with a tweet. He didn't feel that he was loyal enough. And there's questions that he's going to get rid of the FBI director. So the security establishment, the establishment which you want to be apolitical and stable, is his target. So that's a serious issue. And then there's speculation about the future. Is he going to ever concede? Will he ever sort of like, he hasn't released the funds to Biden for the transition. These are serious issues. And there's some who suspect that he'll never concede. And that when eventually he will have to leave because the election will be certified and the life goes on, he may in fact indicate an intention to run again in 4 years' time, in which case he will preserve his authority as sort of like the head of the Republicans. And that's why many Republican officials are very cautious in terms of making any statements about the election. They realize that their future may actually be dependent upon Trump for an additional 3 or 4 years. So we have a particularly difficult period right now.
Oh, wow. Dioceldo, George, anybody want to pipe in about this concern?
Well, I felt it's a very scary scenario now in America. It looks like it's worse than here in the Philippines. So I just hope this will not happen. The worst thing will not happen. I can just imagine firing the Secretary of Defense, NBI director, just to favor himself in this possible electoral protest. And obviously, there will be quite chaotic. And if you want to fight against Trump, there will be in deep trouble. You might just be arrested and put in jail. So it's gonna be very scary and chaotic. We just prayed and hope nothing that serious will happen, as it will definitely affect globally.
Yes. And there's still that last month. We are going to December before January, which is the declaration, right? The swearing in. George, anything you'd like to share before I move on to another topic?
Yes, I think that the point is very good, but because of this tension there, and it's distracted their attention from the ASEAN for the moment. But if we concentrate on our economy, then we will be able to navigate and balance out and continue to benefit from relations with both parties, which we've benefited from more in the last 4 years than the previous administration, because the investments, even while Duterte took an independent foreign policy, what happened was investments, including from Japan, became a multiple, from the EU, from the US, became a multiple of what it was before, much like a girl having several suitors ends up having more benefits. No? So it depends on how we balance things, and Mr. Yukon's ideas are very useful for us to, and I'm sure he has so many ideas we've read in his YouTube that we can adopt and learn from.
I'd like to check, thank you for that, George. I'd like to check if Anna May is here. Anna May? All right, there she is. Hi, Anna May. Just again, we're talking about what will happen first in the next month before we delve into everything else that Yukon actually said that might happen in the Biden administration. But first, what the immediate concern will be what will happen in the next month or so, which again is a cause of concern, as Yukon said himself. How about you? Thoughts from your end, Anna May? You're on mute. Please kindly unmute. Thank you.
I think Sir George is correct. In fact, the Philippines has benefited in an increase in an independent foreign policy. There is an increase in foreign direct investments in the Philippines. If we look at the numbers comparatively on a year-to-year period, and even in a 4-year time span.
All right, so let's get into that then. You already brought up about how tariffs, trade wars, and this is actually the reason why we've gathered here this morning. When Dioceldo said, as a businessman, there are pros and cons. He got concerned about what's been happening, particularly the major impacts of President Trump's tariffs and trade wars with China, what they've done to the global economy. Dioceldo, would you like to start this ball rolling?
Well, personally, I hope that upon Biden presidency, I was looking that there will be a more stable, harmonious, predictable relationship between U.S. and China, because it's like in a family, if the two head of state or the two parents are not fighting, it's easier to work in a peaceful environment. While if they're fighting, the policies will keep on changing, and our working environment will be very unstable. It's so hard to run a company or the business if the situation is not stable and predictable.
But in Yukon, any comments on this in line of what you said? What you predict for the Biden administration is that you're looking for something unifying, including the world, for his foreign policies. Anything else you'd like to expound on that?
Well, let me just emphasize that we all recognize that Asia's prosperity depends upon stable trade and investment relations. The region has prospered relatively better than the other regions over the last several decades because it has a production sharing network. So parts and components are produced everywhere, including the Philippines. They're assembled in China. They go to Europe, the United States. Foreign investment comes. It comes not just to China, but it goes to all the other ASEAN countries, including the Philippines. So that served Asia very, very well. President Trump's tariffs have had a negative effect on everyone. So the focus was on the fact that China would suffer, that it would not be able to export as much to the US. The great irony is that China's trade balance actually improved after the tariffs, and improved in ways which people did not predict, because China was able to export more to other places, including ASEAN. So China's exports to ASEAN soared. China's exports to Europe soared. China actually exported a lot more to Mexico, which was then remanufactured and sent to the United States. So today, after the trade war and the tariffs, China's trade balance has improved. Now, ironically, America's trade deficits have gotten worse. Okay? So when President Trump launched this, he thought that he would be able to improve his trade balance. That hasn't happened. But more importantly, people have realized that the growth of the United States has suffered. Growth has suffered everywhere, actually. So no one wins in a trade war. So I think a key issue for President Biden is he willing to reduce these tariffs? Because if he did, everybody would benefit, including other Asian countries. And I think this is the key issue. But he's unlikely to do so immediately, because if he did immediately, people would think he's too soft on China. So the key issue is, what can China do to give Biden comfort, or to give Biden an excuse to lower the tariffs? And I think that the question will then be, will President Biden revive what I call strategic dialogue discussions with China? And then will China signal something like, I will unilaterally cut my tariffs, I will liberalize American investment in China, and send out a gesture? And if he did that, then Biden, I think, would actually be willing to cut tariffs, and I think everyone would be better off.
George, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this.
Yes, as Mr. Yukon had said, the U.S. did not benefit in terms of the goods trade. In 2019, it was almost the same. In 2020, the U.S. trade deficit grew substantially bigger. However, China's deficit with the U.S. deficit with China dropped by about $80 billion, which means that in that respect, they were able to hurt China from U.S. trade basis. But again, as pointed out by Mr. Yukon, versus the world, China actually improved its surplus position. So the investments the investments that went out of China or are planned to go out of China, most of the companies are going to retain majority of their investments in China, but they will expand outside. And what's happened is that the investments were not going to the U.S. The survey shows that less than 4% of these companies thought they were going to move it to the U.S. So they did not bring the jobs back to China. In the end, it becomes in this globalized world, maybe we're looking at competitiveness as the key thing, unless there's a successful decoupling, which remains also for the Philippines. So most of the world did not benefit from the trade war. There's a few very big winners like Vietnam, no, and we are just here at the edge. Thailand and some countries became recipients of the investments, and the Philippines has the chance to do that if our build works and the people create the enterprises, because the infrastructure is not enough. It's more than just physical infrastructure.
Before we actually get to infrastructure, he also touched on this. Yukon mentioned manufacturing. So during the pandemic, supply chains obviously were disrupted. Many news articles were published saying American manufacturing firms started pulling out of China. How likely is this to push through with the new administration? Which countries might be beneficiaries of these firms pulling out of China? Yukon?
You mentioned a very important issue. President Biden is less focused on trade balances, unlike President Trump. So he's not favoring tariffs. He's going to focus much more on improving America's competitiveness at home. So he's talking about infrastructure, education, becoming more innovative. And then he says, if we do that, we can compete with China. So less sort of like attacking China, more like let's begin at home. But let me go back to your point, because I think it's a very important point for the Philippines, actually. Supply chains, people thought the supply chains would shift because of the trade war, that manufacturing or companies would move out of China and go elsewhere. Then when the pandemic came, people said, well, Europe, United States, we cannot be so dependent on China for medical supplies, masks, ventilators. We need to be able to build them at home. Now, the reality has been the opposite, actually. China's exports have surged in the last 3 or 4 months because global demand for pandemic equipment, global demand for computers and communication equipment, China has strong capacity. But that export surge went way beyond these medical supplies and communications to a broader range of industrial product lines. So in the last 2 months, China's increase globally of exports has increased by about 28, 30%. And it's generating a huge surplus. It's not going to be this level, but surprisingly larger than we would expect it. The so-called supply chain disruption hasn't actually happened because China's gotten its manufacturing capacity back sooner than everyone else, and everyone else is still suffering from disconnections and disruptions. So that's the first point. But the second point I think is very interesting. Have manufacturers been moving out of China? And where are they going? And are we likely to see that continuing? And the answer is it will continue. Labor intensive and other product lines will continue to move out of China, but probably far slower than people would predict. There still will be continued more foreign investment in China, but not as great as before. So I don't think the supply chain will shift dramatically. Then the question is who's won? And so far in Asia, the only country that's really won is Vietnam. It's basically benefited a lot from the so-called shifting of manufacturers from China out. But here's the issue. Vietnam's manufacturing capacity essentially has hit the ceiling. There's limit, it's a small country, and it really cannot absorb any more. So the next question will be, where else in East Asia can manufacturing go to strengthen what I call regional supply centers? And I think this is where Philippines has a real opportunity. It has a good labor force. It has willing people. It has this language capacity. It has a culture that's very receptive. So I go back to the point that you made earlier about the build. That's a key issue. Infrastructure limitations in the Philippines is the major concern. Foreign direct investment restrictions in the Philippines are actually still not as good as they could be. So they need to be addressed. There are also issues about corruption and power shortages and other issues. There's also, I think, a difficult issue for the Philippines to deal with. You're extraordinarily successful in the export of skilled and semi-skilled workers abroad. So Filipinos dominate the labor force globally. You bring back a lot of money because of them. And that's one reason why the Philippines has been growing relatively well for almost 10 years now. You're having 5, 6, 7% growth rates. I think it's actually quite impressive. But the problem with this strategy, which has relied and been very successful on the exporting of people, it reduces the incentive to improve manufacturing at home. Okay? if you can earn a lot of foreign exchange by exporting people and then send it back, then the peso is actually stronger than it should be, and it makes it harder for manufacturing exports in the Philippines to take off. So I think a critical issue in the Philippines in the future, deal with infrastructure, deal with the regulations, but you also have this issue of, can I try to get the incentives for manufacturing to go up and rely less on the exports of Filipino workers abroad? And that to me is a key difference between Vietnam and the Philippines today.
Dioceldo, comments on this. Josette or George, who would like to go first?
I think the problem here in the Philippines is for foreign investment to come is very restrictive. There are two things. Number one, ownership of land. Only 40% that the foreigner can earn, as well as in a local corporation, they can only own up to 40% of the corporation. I think there should be a drastic change in this composition to probably make it 60 or 75% ownership by the foreign investors. Otherwise, they will not like to come in. And because of all this money laundering thing, it's very extremely hard for foreign investment to come in if there's no legal move to have it to explain why the money is coming in. So if it's legally coming in, it should be saying that they're buying 60% or 75% of a certain corporation or purchase of land before it can be called legitimate. Otherwise, nobody likes to do all this using proxies on their corporations. So it's a different time already. So I think our policymakers should start looking in changing the ownership structure of foreign investors here in our country.
To increase transparency in business
ownership.
To increase transparency for business relations. George, anything you'd like to add to this one?
Yes, the transferring of manufacturing here is more difficult than the transfer of other value addeds because it requires infrastructure that takes years to build, and happily that we've started in this road. It also requires certain skills to be trained up. What is already in the Philippines, easier for the Philippines to adopt, which we've been adopting to some extent, is services. So very much we'd be interested in if the US, I suppose they may not be emphasizing that they will continue to outsource because that's a major industry in the Philippines, bringing in about $30 billion a year. We were hoping that the new leg, the tourism, would grow. You know, it had come to about $10 billion a year already and was growing very fast. But because of the pandemic, that's become a problem. In terms of the regulation, we have outside of China, the highest taxes in this part of the world. We have the longest process times, and we have infrastructure traffic that is the worst in this region. But hopefully all of this is already being worked on. So maybe this will take about 4 or 5 years. If we work together, these situations will improve. We have to see if these tax and other regulatory issues that can be lifted easier can attract people in time, because currently the wave of decisions are being made to transfer. And if we don't catch the wave, it will be another period, maybe another 7 years or so before people decide again where they're going to place their new manufacturing facilities.
Actually, I think we're heading there already. That's why we have Anime back. Let's talk about China's Belt and Road Initiative then, since we are really circling around the idea of infrastructure already and the need for it. So bringing Ms. Anime into the fray, China's been promoting economic development and investing into the infrastructure development of many countries through their Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. Actually, Yukon mentioned that with the Biden administration, they are responding to this strategy as well. Yukon, would you like to expound more on the Belt and Road Initiative that you brought up earlier?
The Belt and Road Initiative was one of President Xi Jinping's signature policy initiatives. It has what I call a strong economic basis. That is, if you connect better the countries in Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, then everyone will benefit. And the key focus there was Europe. Asia is very well connected with the US and North America. It's not as well connected logistically with Europe. So why is this so important? Not too many people realize this, but European presence in terms of manufacturing and investment in China is twice as high as America's. So if you go to manufacturing plants in China, you will see European companies and you will see actually European managers and workforce there. So Germany gets 30 to 40% of its global exports from products manufactured in China. Okay. And therefore, and this is the key issue, European is the manufacturing region. America is not. America is an agricultural economy and a services-oriented economy. It's not a manufacturing economy. If you look at America's economic structure, only 9% of its labor force is in manufacturing, 91% is in services, okay? So this issue about manufacturing and its interests, radically different. Europe has a much larger percentage of its labor force in manufacturing. And therefore, if you go to Beijing or Shanghai and you go to the shopping malls and you look around, they're 90% European. There's practically no American company there in a retail sense. So I think this issue of the Belt and Road connectivity is driven by these forces. But then you have these concerns. Is China going to use this program to address what I call political strategic interests? Is it going to create a so-called debt trap for various countries? And I think the answer is that some projects certainly have been misdesigned. And I think China needs to be much more careful in terms of dealing with these issues. And I think there's a lot of potential synergism between the Belt and Road and the Philippines Build, Build, Build program. And the question is, can you get the Build, Build, Build program more connected in a truly economic and technical way with China's? And what are the lessons from China's infrastructure? China is investing about 15% of its GDP in infrastructure. Your Build, Build, Build program is trying to get that percentage up from about 3 to 4% in the past to 6 to 8% in the future. And still only be about half of what China did in order to grow 10% a year. So then the question is, how can you get it up there so fast? And I think there are lessons in China that Philippines could actually pick up.
Thank you for that, Yukon. I think Anna May would like to join in the discussion for this now. Yes, Anna May, go ahead.
I also want to comment slightly about foreign direct investments. There were questions in the chat box. So, for example, in 2017 and 2018, there's an unprecedented growth as far as foreign direct investments are concerned. So it's now at $20.1 billion. I mean, this is unprecedented in the same way that it is almost double of what we've got in 2015, which was only at 5.6 billion US dollars. And if you actually look backward or 10 years ago, which is 2010, the net foreign direct investment inflows were only at $1.1 billion. Well, it inched up a little at about $2 billion in 2011, $3.2 billion in 2012, 3.7 in 2013. But if you look at the jump and the increase as far as foreign direct investments are concerned, vis-a-vis an independent foreign policy, I think you'd see substantial gains as far as FDI is concerned. And just to give a brief input also on the manufacturing sector. In 2017, the Philippine government passed the 2017 Investment Priorities Plan, which was designed to spread the benefit of the country's fast economic growth to the countryside, which emphasizes on the manufacturing sector and job-generating businesses. In fact, there was an economic growth in 2018, which was at about 6.9%. And this was largely pushed by the robust manufacturing sector. I would agree that there is much to be done for the manufacturing sector. but there has been substantial gains. For example, the manufacturing industry expanded by 9.4% in 2018 and increased its share in GDP by 22.4% in the third quarter of 2017. I mean, I think these are very substantial gains as far as foreign direct investments in manufacturing is concerned. If we also look at the Biden administration's plan on infrastructure, which it calls a Build Back Better, I think it has actually a very good synergy with the Build program of the administration. I mean, when I've read about it, it's mostly about the job generating. It's pushing a national effort towards an improved American infrastructure that's worth about $2 trillion. And I think this is exactly what BBB is doing now. I mean, since 2016, the Philippine government was able to generate about 6.57 million jobs because of infrastructure. We have developed 25,000 kilometers of roads, 5,271 bridges, about 9,797 flood control projects. Senator Biden has been talking about an improved infrastructure design, and Philippines has also been doing this. We've also improved even the designs for our classrooms. And I think because of this independent foreign policy, we're now working with US, we're now working with Japanese, we're now working with the Chinese government, we're also working with the Korean government. So if you think about the spectrum of infrastructure projects now, you're going to see that a lot of there are multilateral cooperations, and not just with China. For example, we have investments with China on two bridges, the Pantaleon-Estrella Bridge and the Binondo-Intramuros Bridge. But if we look also at the bigger picture, the Japanese government is also helping us with the Plaridel Bypass, with the Metro Manila Subway. If you talk about the Korean government, we're working with them on the Pangil Bay Bridge, and if we actually take a look at we even have a cooperation with the French government, which does the Cebu bus rapid transit facility. So I think it's just we sort of like think of this as international cooperation. And I also want to ask Mr. Huang as to whether he thinks there will be as to what the Blue Dot Network will play as far as the ASEAN region is concerned.
Oh, okay. Would you like to take that first, Yukon? The Blue Dot, yes? Sorry, you're on mute.
Can you elaborate with me a little bit more about the Blue Dot, what you mean by that?
Well, there's a Blue Dot Network, which is collaboration between US, China, and Australia, who I think are, and then there's the US International Development Finance Corporation. So I think these are multilateral cooperation strategies similar to the BRI that we've launched. And people are saying, for example, the two bridges we're working with China, they're about to be completed by next year, and they are well underway.
That's fine. Let me begin by saying that if I were taking a Philippine position, my advice would be get wherever you can get the money from and help from whoever makes sense. And you just have to be clever enough in evaluating the projects and proposals. Ultimately, the responsibility for the quality of the projects is Manila's responsibility. You have to make that judgment rather than depend upon whether it's Japanese judgment or Chinese or US. In the end, if you, the Philippines, make the decision, this is what you want, it's technically solid, economically sensible, then you get the best terms, and then you'll be fine. Don't let any foreign lender or developer dictate the terms or the design. You have to make that decision yourself. That's the first point I'd make. The second point I would make is something which people have never fully understood. When you go to an infrastructure program, there's always this issue about we don't have the money. Our budget is not adequate. How can we finance this? So I was World Bank director starting from the mid-90s in China for 10 years. And China's budget, extraordinarily weak. They had no money at all. They couldn't finance any infrastructure investment. So the interesting thing about China for about 2 or 3 decades, how did it finance a massive infrastructure program without any practically financial support from its own budget? Okay. And it didn't have a lot of foreign aid because it didn't like to get foreign aid. Okay. So the interesting model that China had was that when it built these roads, it built these highways, it always built them in a design. For example, there are no roads, major roads in China, which are not toll roads. They're all toll roads. Okay? As soon as they built a major highway and they had a toll road on it, it turned out in 3 or 4 or 5 years, the toll road collection paid for the road. And then they took the collateral of that toll road to build the next toll road. So once the toll road system got going into China, they didn't need any money, either from the domestic budget or from foreigners. Then you go into these other, the high-speed rail and other areas. Those areas did need support. They didn't generate enough fares in the beginning. So they had to borrow on this. But they're able to actually figure out how to collateralize their revenues in a way they could get better terms. So the interesting thing about China's infrastructure program, and you go to power plants and you go to water supply systems, everything else, they focused on the revenue connection and tariffs. So it was a way of actually funding a massive infrastructure program, even though the government budget per se was so-called weak. And there was private-public partnerships. I know the Philippines also has PPI kinds of programs. So I'm just saying that there is a lesson to be learned because the same problem is occurring in India. They need massive infrastructure, but the federal budget is broke. And the question is, how can India build all this stuff? Well, I go back to the fact when China began, it was totally broke also. Yet it found a way of financing it. So that's one issue. The other issue I think is really interesting. You cannot deal with the infrastructure program and speed it up unless you deal with, as I think George and others have mentioned, the land problem. Access to land and use of land is the key bottleneck in every country. So China went through a legislative process which basically gave the state the power to command and take over land. Now, of course, they have an authoritarian system. They could do this more brutally than you can do it elsewhere. But the reality is no massive infrastructure program can move forward quickly without a means of actually getting the land. And why does it have to be quick? Because if you spend a lot of time trying to build up the land and getting it developed, the costs soar. It becomes prohibitively expensive. So the key issues that I think that somebody can learn from China is, how did they get around this land problem, legally speaking, many ways? And how did they get around this financing constraint so easily? Because every other country seems to be stuck on that. The last thing I want to mention, because I think it's actually quite important here, when you talk about foreign investment coming in from everywhere, and I think you should mobilize it, there is tremendous potential of getting more foreign investment from China. If you go to Vietnam, a lot of the new manufacturing exported industries in Vietnam are actually being financed by Chinese companies. And they're doing that because they realize they can't produce that in China anymore, it's too expensive, but they can do that in Vietnam. If you go to Mexico, Mexico has a trade link with the United States. A lot of the new companies in Mexico, their money is coming from Chinese companies. Chinese companies say, I can't get into the US market because of the tariffs, but I can get into by producing in Mexico and exporting to America. So you find foreign investment from China going to Vietnam and Mexico, and they're going to other countries because Chinese companies are saying, I cannot continue in China. Wages are too high. There are potential tariffs and restrictions. I need to find other centers. I will invest in them, and then I'll produce for the global market. And I personally think that the Philippines are well placed for this.
Wow, good points to let's let that settle down. Dioceldo, I see you're raring over there. You're like a bit restless. Anything you want to add to this before I actually bring up? I've been meaning to pounce on this since actually Yukon mentioned it. How BRI has actually been viewed as a debt trap. But before I go there, thoughts first. Dioceldo, George. Dioceldo first.
Well, I think we just get Yukon as our business consultant for the Philippines. Then that will make our job easier than done. So all the points that Yukon has just said are well taken, are well noted, and I hope our listeners can pick up a lot from them. And it's easy, self-explainable, and I don't think I need to explain further on what Yukon has just told us.
Or at least to pick the mind or pick it apart. George, how about you? Any thoughts on that?
Agree with every point Mr. Yukon has brought up. The responsibility for the viability of the project really depends on the proponent, the country itself. It's not on the financier. We cannot blame the bank unless the financier has forced the project on you. So currently, we all know that's not the case. However, politics is also getting in the way. This debt trap that has been quoted variously almost every year in the Philippines, their source mostly has been this underscore who has come out in Forbes magazine, but is funded by a U.S. military company. It's claiming that China is charging between 10 to 20% without any evidence. Currently, what we know is, for instance, that China has offered in the last 2 years and has been waiting for approval of the projects at 2%, which is far, far lower than everybody except Japan. Japan is about 0.5 or a fraction of a percent, but all the other countries are 3% and up. And the currently Philippine government has a very good bond rating because we have a very low debt to GDP ratio. We were able to borrow this administration at a record 2.75%. But other than that, our corporations have been issuing bonds, and the country also at 3.5 to 7%. So this is already the lowest that you can find. So we don't know, it's as if we don't trust ourselves. But there is reason maybe not to trust ourselves to some extent because our approval processes and so on, as the rights of way become problems, and our politics, we're attacking China. But Indonesia has just approved and already started their Bandung Railway project. They're already on the way of construction. And as Mr. Yukon had brought up, Vietnam, which is in a hot war sometimes with China, is accepting Chinese investment. So it is whether we trust ourselves, but if we're letting politics get in the way, then that is a problem. In the end, it's economic value. This is something I learned when I studied in the US. They said, if you have a good project and it's viable, then the only obstacle is your salesmanship. You have to know how to sell it because there are investors, there's liquidity all around the world now. And I learned that and actually use it in my business, that if we have a good project, if you lack financing, it's because you didn't know how to sell it. And so we have a lot of opportunities here. We should get the right analysis, and we have the right attitude and not let politics get in the way.
Thank you for that. And of course, I think the one best to mention anything about BBB, this debt trap and self-governing when it comes to terms. Yes, please, Anime.
So I agree with Mr. Yukon Huang, and I agree with Mr. George Sy and Boss Deo. When you talk about infrastructure projects, you have to examine their financial and their economic viability. In fact, before an infrastructure project is actually funded, it has to have a net economic rate of return of about 10%. Now, the problem on traffic is very common. I mean, in 2012, the Philippines lost about 2.4 billion a day, according to JICA. And this number has gone up to 3.5 billion a day. And we're only talking about Metro Manila traffic. The road usage in Metro Manila is about 13.4 million trips per day. And this could go as high at 16.1 in a span of 17 years. And without any infrastructure intervention, our loss of 3.5 billion a day will increase to 5.4 billion in 2035. If you don't have any infrastructure intervention. And that is the reason why build came into play. So this was a medium-term goal to increase infrastructure spending from 5.4% of the country's GDP to ultimately 7.3. And if you look at the records in the past 5 decades, the average spending is only at 2.4%. And that's for the last 5 decades. And now the entire government wants to spend at least 7 trillion under this program. But it is us who dictates what the projects are. For example, we have 2 China projects, the Pantaleon Estrella Bridge and the Binondo Intramuros Bridge. These 2 projects are part of the EDSA Decongestion Master Plan, which is a master plan composed of 25 big-ticket projects, which essentially wants to decrease the volume of traffic back to its 1970. When you talk about EDSA, it's an infrastructure circumferential road that was built during the 1930s, expanded in the 1970s, but it's overcapacitated by about at least 40%. So now we want to bring it down to the 1970 level as far as traffic volume is concerned. But we can't do that without creating more alternatives. And that's why this is how projects are being chosen. They are already included in a master plan that would effectively push for a particular purpose. For example, we have the EDSA decongestion for the 2 bridges. For the Pangil Bay Bridge, which is Korean funded, it's under the Mega Bridges Project, which ultimately aims to connect Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao via land travel. And I think this is not something that the present administration could accomplish in its totality, because the longest bridge in the Philippines is only about 2 kilometers. If we're trying to connect Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao, for example, the Panay-Guimaras Negros Bridge is about 20 kilometers, which is 10 times the size of the bridge. And that is why I think this is important. And that's why we believe in science, and that's why we believe in studies in implementing this traffic. But I will address the question on the debt trap. Because
yes.
There's a lot of misconception about these Chinese projects. But for example, under DPWH Build program, there are 2, and these are grants, meaning they are done at no cost to the Philippine government. But as far as China loans are concerned, are the provisions standard, meaning are the provisions in a Philippine-China loan accord standard in all loan agreements? Yes. I mean, the provisions in China loan agreements is no different from the loan agreement in done via Japan. And for example, our arbitration clauses standard. These are all standard. But if you look at the statistics, because I think it's important to go back to the statistics when we talk about debt trap diplomacy, because it's unreal. It's a fake news when you say that ang interest rate that we're paying is about 10%, because it's not true at all. We're not even paying anything for the 2 bridges as far as the 2 bridges are concerned. But if you look at the statistics, and if you look at the debt to GDP ratio of the Philippines actually ranks among the top 40 countries with low debt to GDP ratio of less than 40%. Now, there's the debt trap. We usually compare it with Sri Lanka, but if you compare Philippines ranking via Sri Lanka, the Philippines ranked 33rd with a debt to GDP ratio of 33.7 in 2017 to 2018, while Sri Lanka ranked 109th with a debt to GDP ratio of about 77.3%. So I think that is this misleading? All these talks misleading? I think they are misleading, because if you look at the sources, you wouldn't even see any sources. These are just claims. But what I can say is that the Department of Finance is doing a very great job in negotiating these loans to various countries, to China, to Japan, to South Korea, to US, and I guess this is the kind of policy that you want, an independent foreign policy, so that we get the best deals possible when we talk about the infrastructure program. In fact, in 2019, the revenue is at an all-time high, which is at 16.1%. And the debt, this is the highest rate we've had for 22 years. And when we talk about the debt to GDP ratio, it's at 39.6%, which is the lowest since 1986. And that's it.
Actually, yes, anime definitely took the brunt with everything with regards to infrastructure. But yes, everyone agrees that I think with how Yukon actually broke it down with the three ways of, especially when it comes to infrastructure and investing, we've pretty much covered most of the bases, all definitely well noted. And all well taken into consideration, and hopefully something we can probably apply, if not lobby for. But getting back to putting the spotlight on Yukon, shall I ask this next question then? And it did come from our viewers. Any of the speakers can comment on this, but particularly for me, I'd like to hear from Yukon. So do you think the United States under a Biden's presidency will accept the rise of China as an economic and technological equal possibility? Yes. Yukon?
Thanks. Thanks for that question. It's a big question. Let me begin by noting we have a parallel example decades ago when Japan was becoming an economic power, generating huge trade surpluses. People were writing about Japanese manufacturing systems, how they're going to take over the world. America had a hard time accepting that. There was a lot of discussion, anti-Japanese sentiments. They eventually were able to have the so-called Plaza Accord, which essentially forced Japan to appreciate its currency, to restrict its exports, to satisfy U.S. worries that Japan might become too powerful economically. The consequence of that is decades of stagnation, which still continues. So China is very aware of the so-called Japanese experience. And also we now have a situation where China, in a global sense, is much bigger than Japan was ever. So the issue is, can America accept, again, a rising economic power who might threaten its status in a global sense? I think the answer is it couldn't do it for Japan. It wouldn't accept it for Japan. It's unlikely to accept it for a China situation. Less likely. And why is it less likely? It's because public opinion is so negative toward China. And the issue is so negative toward China in the West because of what I would call, we have one world, two systems. You have the Western market democratic systems, and you have what people see as a Chinese authoritarian system, socialist communism blend. So for many people in the West, the rise of China is not just an economic issue. It's an existential threat to the way of life in the West. And this is extremely difficult to deal with. And for me, it's a big challenge because China needs to think about, how do I deal with this perception issue? It's a perception, a sense of unfairness, assertiveness. And I go back to whenever I speak to the Chinese authorities, you have to deal not with just the government per se. You have to deal with this common perception among the population in the West. And I think it actually can be handled. I also remind everyone, 10 years ago, the majority of views in the West was positive toward China. China's system hasn't changed, but views were much more positive. And the key issue was China did not seem so threatening then. So we now have, for example, in today's discussion, the concern is a Belt and Road Initiative, which should be just what I call economic technical proposal, is seen as a strategic threat or as a weapon. And this is the key issue that China needs to address, because if it cannot, I see it's very difficult for the West, even under Biden, to sort of like accept China as a new, what I call a different kind of power. And it needs a different kind of a power status in the region. And I think, President Obama couldn't accept that. Vice President Biden worked for him. And the challenge for Biden, he's going to be a bit different. I think he's a bit more of a realist. And he also realizes that you don't solve this problem by just threatening China. You have to solve this problem by building the capacity at home to compete more effectively. And I think that is a sensible approach. And then from China's side, my advice to the China's side is you need to deal with a perception, global perception. You cannot become what I call a great power without getting what I call better goodwill. Build your soft power weapons. Don't try to attack it from an economic or hard power sense. You have to get people to see China as a potentially positive force rather than as a concern.
Just thank you for that, Yukon. Dioceldo, George, Anime, thoughts on this one. How can we balance the two then? What could be a good way to move forward, especially with regards to these two countries that the Philippines definitely deals majorly with? Dioceldo, George, would you like to take this one?
Well, we have a lot of things to learn from both sides. I think it's very obvious that the U.S. is still the #1 market in the world, although China is fast catching up and probably will surpass in some categories. Technology-wise and culturally, we have a very strong affinity with the U.S. But China is right beside us, and so is ASEAN, which is the fastest growing region also in the world. So we have to, just the same as the US that Biden may be looking at, build our internal capacity. And it's not just physical. The build can help on the physical, but we have to study the financial, whether we're doing it correctly, because in truth is some of the projects, we should question the viability of some of these glamour projects that maybe the volume is not yet sufficient and needs to be built over a number of years. And we do have various investments. US has been giving us a lot of business in terms of services, the BPOs. And so this is an act of friendship that we should appreciate and develop. But we should be like India, not just doing the call center and low level. We have to move up. We have to have a strategy. Our people have to have a cultural change also. We don't spend all our time, 12 hours a day on social media. No, this is the statistics. 6.5 hours on Facebook, 12 hours on social media, and our process, our approval rates is very, very slow. So Panhua, a Chinese investment that has it's $3.5 billion, has been waiting for years for approvals. Just like our other projects, the rails, we have rights of way problems, the South Rail, and so on. For instance, the JICA Metro Manila, I think at least that is going to go ahead. It's very apparent that it's viable from a social financial viewpoint, not necessarily from a private enterprise viewpoint. So we have to look at things on a multidimensional level, and from a social, from a public level, and from a private corporate level. Then if we build this capacity, then we cannot be having to depend on the winds that are blowing in the world.
Thank you for that. Dioceldo, especially someone who does a lot of business relationships with both countries. Your thoughts on this?
Well, I think China has been very beneficial, not only to us in the cosmetics industry, but what we get from the US is more on the fashion trending. So what's selling in the US, for sure, Filipinos will love to follow them. As you know, Filipinos look very look highly on the American way of living. As you can see, U.S. is like a dreamland for our Filipinos, while China is obviously our factories that we have most of our products produced there. So there seems to be a balance of power. The supply from China and the fashion trend is from the U.S. So the harmonious working relationship between the two powerful countries is extremely beneficial to the Philippines. So we're hoping that with the newly elected President Biden, there will be lesser tension, and then looking forward that there will be a more harmonious relationship between the two countries.
Dioceldo, I just want to touch on this. Someone asked, will China keep the open door policy, or will it revert to the Maoist self-reliance, self-sufficiency policy at home, since it's been blocked in the global chain? Semiconductors, etc., etc. Anyone knowledgeable about this one?
I think
it was asked.
I think Yukon will be more knowledgeable on.
Yeah, sorry. Do you think China will keep the open door policy, Yukon? Revert to the self-reliance or self-sufficiency policy at home, since they have been blocked in the global chain. Yes, Yukon, sorry.
I wrote an article recently. The heading, the theme, was that China is hostage to a rules-based global economic system. Okay? It's a hostage to a rules-based multilateral global system. That's unlike Russia. Russia and China are often classified as in the same pot. Russia is different. Its power, its economic strength does not depend upon global trade or foreign investment. Russia's economic strength comes from oil and minerals. That's why it doesn't care about relationships. It can threaten countries, and even if they throw a sanction, Russia doesn't worry. Okay? China is different. China's strength comes from being the #1 major trading partner for 124 countries. #1. Okay? It's the second largest source of foreign investment next to the United States. This trade and foreign investment relationship depends upon what I call established, stable, rules-based global system. So when we talk about China, will it be closed? Will still remain open. If it closes, China cannot survive. Okay, it needs contacts, relationships. So then the question will be, what about this high-tech restrictions that America is imposing? And what about China's desire to become self-sufficient in semiconductors and key equipment? Well, let me just raise two observations. If every country tries to be self-sufficient across the board, no one is going to be successful. You're going back to the Stone Age. In the Stone Age, every country produced what it needed and didn't count on anybody else. And therefore, growth was stagnant. Knowledge did not flow. Trade never occurred. So trying to be closed essentially is stagnation. That's true for America as it is for China. So when the IMF did a study a year ago and asked the question, suppose you decouple the US and China economies in high tech and certain kinds of industries, what would happen? Well, the answer was in the short term, because China is more dependent upon these goods, China suffers. It loses maybe 2 percentage points in growth. In the 3 to 4 to 10 year horizon, America suffers more. Its growth rate is cut in half. Why is that? Because these top 20 or 30 US companies producing these high-tech equipment, they depend on China for anywhere from 25 to 70% of their revenues. When they cannot sell to China, they cannot invest. And they cannot invest, America's innovative strength is destroyed. And America only grows through innovation. Okay, China grows from building roads and doing all sorts of things. But the American economy only grows from innovation. And when its most innovative companies cannot invest, then America's growth rate basically stagnates. So now we have a stalemate kind of a problem. And the answer, actually, which I don't think people have focused on, we have a problem in terms of economics is being dominated by security concerns. So many goods have both a commercial use and a security use. How do you deal with this? Well, the reality is you cannot assure the politicians and the military people and the establishment that you can be secure enough. They just won't accept it. So they go overboard. What we need now in the future, which we do not have, is a global agreements on how to deal with equipment, technology, semiconductors that have a security concern, how they should be regulated, how they should be controlled and inspected. For example, 5G is the big issue. The solution to the 5G is Huawei should go into partnership with Ericsson and others in building 5G networks in Europe. It shouldn't go alone. The only way it can get some assurance that people will be comfortable with, it must partner with a European company. And that European company must provide the assurance that there's no security and other threat. And this is sort of, I think, is a thing that we've been missing, a recognition that there are certain kinds of issues, products, whatever, where we cannot establish enough trust. The world is not able to do so. So how do we get a global understanding? How do we get a partnership? Now, we've done this in nuclear proliferation. We established an agency. Agency can inspect. It provides assurance. It certifies. We're going to have to do this in security-related product lines. If we can do that, then we don't have to have countries saying, I have to be self-sufficient. I have to rely only on myself. Because if you do, you're basically saying, I'm going to grow slower. I'm not going to make any progress. We haven't quite gotten there yet.
Thank you. I love how you broke that down. Thank you very much. By the way, to our panel, to our viewers, I'm already asking your questions. I believe our production team actually merged some of your questions so that because your thoughts are actually still along the same lines. So I am asking them to our panelists. Still on Yukon, spotlight on him, because you already talked about your books. From your book, Cracking the China Conundrum, Why Conventional Economic Wisdom is Wrong, you actually mentioned one of China's success was the Deng Xiaoping's unbalanced reform. You mentioned why China and Russia are not in the same pot. Anything else you want to add, maybe that we can learn about what you wrote about, Deng Xiaoping's unbalanced reform? Anything that we can probably learn from it or apply here?
Yeah, my book was basically trying to explain to a Western and actually even to a Chinese audience that if you look at what's going on in China and you try to make judgments, we cannot think about them in the normal way we think about something, because we all are brought up in a certain way of thinking, training. I was brought up with a Western training in terms of institutions and economics. It doesn't work in China. But the reality is some of the socialist thinking in China also doesn't work. So I was trying to forge a view of how do you look at a country which is economically different. For example, in economics, and I have good representatives here, economics tells us that business prosperity comes from companies. Companies like Dioceldo Sy's cosmetic firm. A company buys, invests, prospers, as long as you have good tax policies and open environment, okay? And they compete. And when you compete, the profits are basically grow, but it's checked by competition. And that's our view of markets and firms. We have a problem in China because in China, you not just have firms which compete and invest and grow, local authorities invest, develop, grow, and compete. And we don't have that in any other country. So we don't have to worry about this. Now, we also have, let me give you another issue. If we don't recognize that, we have a problem. You take the issue of corruption. Corruption is a big issue everywhere. It's a big issue in the Philippines. The general view is that corruption is bad for growth because it discourages investment. We waste resources. And therefore, countries which are very corrupt don't grow very rapidly. So in my book, I asked the question, China is very corrupt. How come it grew so rapidly? And the more corrupt it became, the faster it grew. And it's the only country that has this kind of a paradox, because corruption in India is bad for growth. Corruption in Indonesia is bad for growth. So how come corruption in China didn't cause slow growth? It actually caused China to grow faster. And the answer is very strange, because all the resources, land, financial, energy, is owned by the state in China. But the state cannot generate high returns. It just doesn't. It doesn't have the entrepreneurship, the commercial practices. Private entrepreneurs have that. So how did private entrepreneurs in China get access to state-owned assets? Corruption did it. The transfer of state-owned assets and the use of these assets to private firms through bribes and other kinds of arrangements, some legal, some illegal, allowed private entrepreneurs to use these assets, invest it, and grow very, very rapidly. And you still keep what I call a socialist economy, because these assets are still owned by the state formally. But the use of these assets now, basically, the use of it is done by the private sector. So these are examples of what I call conventional wisdom doesn't always work. When you go back to unbalanced growth, 10 years ago, everyone was saying China cannot make it. Its growth is unbalanced. It invests too much, it consumes too little. That was the argument. So in my book, I posed the question, unbalanced growth only occurs in a handful of countries historically. Only a handful. And the answer is only successful countries. So if you go back 100 years, the most unbalanced economy historically was the United States. Between 1900 and 1950, it invested enormously, consumed very little. It became the world's biggest industrial power. And then more recent times, the only unbalanced economies were Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and then China. Now, if you look in East Asia, the economies which are most unbalanced grow the fastest. The economies which are most balanced grow slower. In that category, it's the Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand. Actually, the economies are more balanced. They don't grow rapidly. And the answer is counterintuitive. Growth is inherently unbalanced. Okay? A company that which grows very, very rapidly, its sales, assets, inventories are changing rapidly. It's unbalanced. A firm which is not growing very rapidly is very, very stable, but nothing's changing. It doesn't grow. So we missed the point. Unbalanced growth is actually slow growth. Excuse me, unbalanced growth is actually rapid growth.
Rapid, yeah.
Growth tends to be slow.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. Again, economic lesson right there. So to wrap things off, again, I think this is going to be relevant for every panelist to answer. Dioceldo, George, Anna May, how can the Philippine government make the most of U.S.-Philippine-China relations? After all, we are looking to hopeful times ahead where unification among division will be addressed, where people hopefully will get along, countries will get along, foreign policies will be friendlier. So how can we, especially the Philippines, make the most of U.S.-Philippine-China relations so that the Philippines can make the most out of these hopeful times ahead? Who would like to start? Dioceldo?
Well, I think from what we hear today from Yukon, obviously we need more inputs or advice from a speaker like Yukon to make us more aware of what's really happening out there. And there are a lot of issues that we ignore or we don't take any notice of. So actually, what Yukon has been saying is enlighten us on the real scenario what's happening in our environment. So all the valuable thoughts that Yukon shared today are well noted by myself. I hope our listeners have well taken note of them as well. And for obvious reasons, we can adapt and apply them on our businesses. And we can also share our all the thoughts to our policymakers that something should be done. Something should be noted of and should be adopted and should be worked on so that it will be more feasible for everyone and take advantage of the coming new President Biden, that there will be the favorable relationship of U.S. and China. And I hope it will also benefit the Philippines as a whole economy and to our people.
Hopefully. Thank you for that, Dioceldo. Shall we go to Anna May for this one? Thoughts on basically the discussion that you heard, both what you contributed, what everyone contributed. How can the Philippine, especially government, make the most of U.S.-Philippine-China relations in light of everything that we discussed today? Anna May?
I think Philippines will benefit from looking at it at a multi-pronged perspective. It needs to examine what are the economic and political options at the table. I mean, the Philippines, I think, will benefit if it works with the Blue Dot Network or with the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, with JICA, with China. I mean, these are legitimate options that the Philippines should evaluate on a per project, per loan agreement basis. And I think we ought to benefit from that.
Thank you for that, Anna May. George, your thoughts, please.
Yes, I think events like this today is very important and useful because there are so many news. We know there's so many misleading news going around.
Yeah.
And,
oh, sorry, George, if I may also ask for your contribution, because a lot of the Chinese businessmen are asking, what's the best way, what's the best that we can get out of this? Yes, please. Back to you, George.
Yes, the because with someone like Yukon here who is highly respected and they will not consider partisan and having a lot of ideas, that's very useful for us and for the media's role to not entirely focus so much, maybe too much on politics and a lot more on how we can improve. Currently, we are in a very good potential situation in that both the US and China are not, unlike a lot of other countries, not just providers of finance, they are themselves the providers of the market, the finance, and the technology. So we are complementary, potentially complementary if we make use of this. So if we take it this way, we'll get ideas from today everywhere. You can get all these ideas from YouTube. We would suggest you watch Yukon there. You learn a lot from him. And maybe also visit IDSICenter.com. We have a lot of news, re-analysis of the news that might be found useful.
Thank you. Anything else, George? Yes?
Yes, and just basically be open-minded. We're South China Sea used to be a common ground, and there was no borders between them. Butch Valdez, one of our earlier USECs, had said it was an area where friendships were formed until people started putting borders. So we have to look at how we can benefit even amidst dispute. We cannot let the disputes be the defining of our relationships entirely.
That was actually something we were supposed to touch on in today's discussion, but we did talk more on business. We decided to center more about business, investment, issues, infrastructure. But yes, whatever tension still persists, I trust that under, again, the Biden administration, it will look to more hopeful times. And that's why I will end with this question for Yukon Huang. Yukon, will a Democrat president preserve or improve its ties with the Philippines, or just like a few Democrat legislators, they put pressure and intervene in our government policy? Just to wrap things up.
Thank you, Ms. Litton. I think that you made a very important point. Biden is coming in at a time when I call the environment for dialogue and discussion in the region is changing. Biden will want to form stronger alliances with the countries in East Asia and Southeast Asia. He sees ASEAN as an important political coalition of countries. He also will see that the Philippines have a potentially major role to be played economically speaking. As I mentioned earlier, Vietnam capacity is more or less used up. The next logical place to build a capacity in East Asia to diversify is the Philippines. So I think you're going to find yourself both politically and economically getting more attention from the Biden administration than you got from a Trump administration. Then let's turn to China. China has major concerns politically and economically. Trade, foreign investment is very important. Its strategic political interests, including the South China Sea, has been a problem. That problem cannot be resolved without the Philippines playing a major role. And it holds what I call a key position in the discussion. And I think for the China, which is keenly interested in reducing tensions with the United States, it has to realize to do that, it has to improve relations with its neighboring countries. And I think the Philippines has a major role in that respect. So this combination of what I call changed political pressures and economic roles gives the Philippines a good opportunity to actually move ahead in a very positive way in the coming period of time. And I think that this is going to be potentially a Philippine period in the next decade.
With that, let's all let that land and settle in indeed. How about a virtual round of applause for our panelists this morning? It's been very, very interesting indeed. We have Mr. Yukon Huang, Dioceldo Sy, George C., and Ana May Lamentillo. I certainly hope everyone watching, not just here in our Zoom, but via Chinoy TV and Manila Bulletin's Facebook pages, we hope you found this truly a gold mine